It's loading. And yeah, so we're live. So good afternoon, everyone. We are starting the second INSULAE interview, and today we have Dr. Elizabeth Dawson with us. And Dr. Dawson is currently a lecturer at Carlow College and has also worked at Dublin College University and Queen's Belfast University. In 2014, she was awarded an Irish Research Council Fellowship and has worked with several institutes. Her work focuses on conversion in the medieval West and saint lives and cults, especially the Patrician cult. Her book titled Lives and Afterlives, the Hiberno-Latin Patrician Tradition, 650 to 12th century, is coming out in August, and you can already pre-order it if you want. It's out in the 1st of August, if I'm not wrong. And for those that are new here with us, INSULAE is a Brazilian interdisciplinary research group focused on the study of Britannia, Ireland, and islands of the Northern Archipelago in antiquity and the Middle Ages. So, Dr. Dawson, thank you for joining us today. It's a great pleasure, and I'm looking forward to read your book. It sounds really, really interesting. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Diego. Thanks for having me here today, actually. It's great. It's a nice day to have it on, the day before St. Patrick's Day.
It is. Yeah, we have some questions about that. So can you please tell us a little bit about your work and how you started to research the cult of St. Patrick?
Well, I suppose when I think about how I started to research St. Patrick, a lot of my work really is it's focused on the hagiography or the saints' lives that are written about St. Patrick. And I guess my interest really started early on when I was in my early university days, because it was a history I'd never really come across before in school. In Ireland, it was mostly modern history that I had studied. So when I took a few modules in the area, I realized that was something I was quite interested in. And I guess I had a particular interest in narrative texts as well. So it was a very good melding of I suppose, my interests. So I started first by looking not necessarily at the patrician cult, but actually for my PhD, I looked at I wanted to look at some of the earliest texts produced in Ireland and how those authors understood conversion. And of course, those earliest narrative texts are texts about saints, so about Columba, Brigit, Patrick. And that was kind of what I was focused on. And while I was doing that work, I then realized that actually, there was a problem in terms of how we understood and how we appreciated the patrician cult through the writings, the earliest writings. I was looking at the 7th century works at that time. So in particular, the works by Murku and by Tyrconnell. And so, there's a particular approach to those lives, which is problematic, particularly in light of the fact that, we know that saints cults develop out of, multiple communities, that important saints like Patrick in particular are saints who I suppose are, created not just by one single community, but by many communities and many different interactions. And so I became interested in that. And that is then what I focused on moving forward after my PhD in my research. And that's really what the book is about. The book focuses on, kind of 5 medieval lives of Patrick and looks at how, across the span of the, early medieval period into the 11th century, what you see is multiple people, multiple groups engaging with Patrick. So that is basically where it all started and where it's all going, I suppose.
Yeah, and it looks like it's going great for you and for your research. And I'd also like to know that most of the time when we are researching medieval history, we are reassessing primary sources, as you said when you were interested in those 5 lives, and you have successfully produced new angles for the Patrician studies. And what is your approach to produce new research ideas and to, decentralize this cult of St. Patrick that was previously on, especially on Armagh?
Well, I think part of it was luck, and the time at which I was actually doing my research. So when I began looking at those lives, again during my PhD, it was the early 2000s really when I started looking at them, and that is a point at which you get significant amount of interdisciplinary work starting in the area. So archaeology in particular, was becoming so central to how we understand early medieval Ireland. But also it was a point at which, kind of digital humanities was really beginning to take off. And so, in many ways, I was influenced by that. I was influenced by the new questions that people were asking because of the new available evidence as well as new available technologies. So it started off fairly basically. When I started my PhD, I started doing really just kind of looking at kind of, just keywords within the lives, let's say, that related to conversion, because that's what I was focusing on. But then that kind of developed. So when I was looking at funding for postdoctoral work, what I started doing was looking at some of the available technology. So when specifically what I did was I looked at how one of the projects in the Royal Irish Academy, the Dictionary of Medieval Latin, how that particular project and the resources that they have might help me in trying to understand the patterns that might be moving through the documents that I wanted to look at, because I was looking at a set of documents that were linked in terms of their source material, that were linked in terms of their subject. So I started looking at that and seeing how I could use that. And some things worked and some things didn't work, as happens with all research. But yeah, I think by using those, being, kind of open to those new ways of doing work, and then also by asking new questions as a result of what was happening elsewhere, that is something that has kind of stood to the research and helped the research along.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm very interested in all of those 5 lives that you read. Were all of them in Latin, or were some of them in Irish as well?
So the ones that I've looked at are the 5 Hiberno-Latin lives.
Okay.
So there's Muirku and Tyrconnell. They're, Latin lives. They're 7th century. And then there's 3 later Hiberno-Latin lives. So Vita Secunda, Vita Quarta, which are kind of paired lives, and then Vita Tertia as well. Now, of course, there is also a very, very important Irish life, the tripartite life of St. Patrick,
Yes.
which I didn't look at, but which also features in the book. But there were good reasons for that. So I suppose when I started out in terms of doing that research, I wanted to look essentially at the trajectory of the material itself. Okay, so I wanted to look at the Latin works. I had intended on also looking at another later Latin work, the one by the life by Jocelyn, but it became very clear when I was doing that work that actually there's a whole plethora of other works, both inside and outside of Ireland, that are affecting how Patrick is actually being venerated. Okay, so you have lives in Irish, you have lives in Latin, but you also have lives that are written in Ireland, changed on the continent, sometimes quite significantly. This includes the lives I'm talking about now. But there's also some other lives written outside of Ireland. And so it became very clear to me that actually, when you look at someone like Jocelyn, you need to have a wider scope. You need to understand the cult from all of those multifaceted kind of perspectives. And so the 5 lives that I've looked at are a contained set, and they are connected in many ways because they're written in Ireland, because they are Latin lives. But like with any project, you have to have a start and you have to have a finish. You know,
Yeah.
you want to do it all, but you can't. But that's what comes next, I suppose.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, because that was my interest in that, because we have so many lives and so much information about St. Patrick. It must be hard to really determine what you're going to look into, and for research, you really have to set limits for that. Otherwise, you're just going to research the same thing for 30, 20, or 40 years, and sometimes you just can't be done. It's just too much, right?
Yeah.
So it's a methodological approach and decision to the research. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And so I would also like to know that so St. Patrick Day, as we said, is just right on the corner, and in many ways, it's a feast used to market Ireland to the international community, and it's a sense of identity as well in the Irish diaspora and other people around the world. And do you think that the cult of St. Patrick and this idea connected to Armagh was used in a similar fashion to sell or strengthen the power of Armagh during the Middle Ages?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is one of the core elements of the cult of Patrick. I think it's important to point out that Armagh is not the only place that Patrick's cult is formed. Okay, and that's probably one of the issues we have within the scholarship. Actually, is this idea that Armagh is the core center of the patrician cult and everything that has to do with Patrick. I mean, this is kind of, I'm putting it in quite a simplistic way, but there is a general sense that anything that comes from Patrick is coming from Armagh. But I really don't think that that's the case. I don't think that that's what the sources point to. Armagh, though, is really, really central. And of course, we know that saints' cults, the promotion of the saint, particularly from a strong ecclesiastical centre like Armagh, or for example with Brigit and Kildare, okay, though obviously there are aspects of that draw in people, draw in power, prestige, and so on, and sustain a monastic community. But I think when we think of the saints' lives, the cult of the saints, we have to think about a much wider dynamic. So saints are not just sustained because they, help one monastic community or one monastic federation. It's a reciprocal relationship between those who are traveling to that monastery, or those who are praying to Patrick at home, or looking for his intercession, and so on. So while yes, that is definitely an aspect of the cult of Patrick, it is not just the only kind of it's kind of not the end game. It's not the only thing that is important. I suppose we think of something like the Book of Armagh. The Book of Armagh is very, very important manuscript, 9th century manuscript, produced in Armagh, contains a number of important texts related to Saint Patrick, and kind of work that has been done on the Book of Armagh does really kind of point to the fact that this might be a book that is written in order to kind of, I suppose, express the importance of Armagh in a kind of an antiquated way, that they're saying, look at us, look at all this material we have. We're associated with Patrick, and look at him. He is the founder of Christianity in Ireland. Okay, so that's a clear example of it. But at the same time, if you look at some of the texts that are within the Book of Armagh, they point to the fact that Patrick is celebrated in Armagh. But if we, let's say, look at the life by Tyrconnell, He's celebrated in Connacht. He's celebrated in all of these other churches around Ireland. So there's a wealth of information that is there that points to Armagh, but it also points to lots of other churches as well, who maybe don't get the same prestige as Armagh, but nonetheless they have this connection with Patrick, because Patrick's the founder of the Irish Church, and that's kind of the core of his importance.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think this idea of decentralizing the cult of St. Patrick, this old idea that the cult of St. Patrick was only centralized in Armagh and not in other places in Ireland. It's an old-fashioned idea. When you mention it, it's insane that no one else has thought of this before and have not talked much about this. I would like to know how this new research, how this places you within the wide scenario of cults of saints and research. How does your new methodology and these new ideas, how do you think how would this revolutionize and change what we think of cult of saints here in Ireland or even in the continent?
Well, I think if we think of someone like Patrick, there is sometimes a real exceptionalism about the saints in Ireland. The kind of idea of these insular saints who are quite different to other saints. And I mean, lots of people have pointed to the fact that that's just not the case. I suppose it's always surprising to me that if you do look at wider studies of sainthood, Patrick doesn't feature really. Okay, he's not really featured alongside your St. Martin's or and so on. Even though really, if we look at that medieval cult, it's not really quite dissimilar. Patrick is a saint who's created in many of the same ways as other saints on the continent are created. I think what's different about Patrick, and certainly I think what's interesting about Patrick in terms of a wider understanding of sainthood, okay, is really the longevity of his cult. I mean, if you were to ask somebody today, tell me about a saint that they might talk to you about the Virgin Mary. They might talk to you about Saint Anthony. They might talk to you about Saint Patrick. Okay, because he's a global phenomenon at this stage. I mean, in a very, very different way, completely re-articulated, and he's gone through so many different, there's so many facets to Patrick and how we understand him today, and that's a whole other story. But what I suppose a study of Patrick does for that the field of exploration in the cult of saints is that you have a cult that is full of vitality through the medieval period and beyond. Patrick is someone who is not a national saint in the same way as many other saints, so your Andrews and so on, or Georges. He's not a national saint really. He doesn't really become that until about the 17th century, because there is such a complex history in Ireland. So here you have this saint who actually, there is a strong adherence to his cult, both inside and outside of Ireland, across the medieval period into the early modern period and beyond. So he's unusual and unique in that sense. So I think that that's something that, in terms of how we understand saints and understand how communities and different groups engage with sainthood and how that develops and how those kind of identity markers develop, that's kind of where Patrick really kind of fits into that.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of this, like this difference of cults and how this idea of saints might be different in different communities. When you decentralize the cult of St. Patrick, did you also find different ways to address St. Patrick and in the cult of St. Patrick, or to write about St. Patrick in these different communities, or was it more uniform?
There's a real uniformity there at its core. Mm-hmm. That uniformity is Patrick is the head of the church, the Irish Church. He's the founder of the Irish Church. He's the converter of the Irish. So there's a real core there, which is, really important for the cult of the saints, because everyone kind of agrees, but then within different texts, you get different stories. Some of them agree, some of them don't agree, but if you have that overarching story about who Patrick is, he's the Bishop of the Irish, the Apostle of the Irish, and so on, then it all works. What you can actually see within the texts is that, yes, some texts have different, the focus is different. So you might get an idea of who the audience is. But I would say also within that each life has lots of different audiences and lots of different communities are able to engage with them. So again, if let's say one example, right, would be how is it that Patrick actually converts the Irish? So everyone agrees he converts the Irish, okay? But the authors all have different views. So we know Muirchú and Tírechán, there are two 7th century authors. Tírechán says that Patrick basically converts the island by going to different churches, or founding different churches, consecrating priests, and moving on and doing that. So he's setting up this institutional framework across the island, okay? Then you go to Muirchú's life. I mean, they could have been writing within 10 years of each other. And Muirchú is basically saying, look at Patrick. Patrick is a miracle worker, comparing him to Moses, kind of drawing on those Old Testament kind of stories. Patrick goes, he defeats the Druids, and he makes the king of Tyre, Loigra, he convinces him to convert through his miracles. So it's a show of strength. Okay, you would expect, and it is often expected, that that is the story. Muirchú's story is the one that continues on because it's the most polished story. But actually, when you get to the later medieval lives, they don't agree. So you have some lives that still say Loigra doesn't convert, and then you have other ones, and then they're bringing in bits of Tírechán in there. So in actual fact, there's lots of different stories and they can all still work together. And part of that has probably got to do with, I suppose, different audiences, different ideas about who Patrick is, what he does. But the ultimate idea is always there. The foundational story of Patrick is common amongst, throughout. And that's really what matters.
Yeah, absolutely. I was dealing with a similar problem when I was looking at the recensions of the Derga's hostel, and we have so many versions and so many different versions, and sometimes the authors in later versions, they try to converge and merge all of these different recensions that they have in their hands and try to stitch them all together, but you still can see these differences that are within the lines. I can read them within the lines, and it's now it's mostly a personal curiosity. I'm really curious to know what can you say to us about these different audiences and how these manuscripts were consumed in their respective communities. Can you say anything about that?
Yeah, it is hard to say. I mean, in terms of getting down to what are they doing? Why are they using these lives? I mean, when I looked at the Hiberno-Latin lives, I assumed that the later ones, that they're preserved on the continent. Okay. And maybe, there's slight differences there, whatever. But I was assuming I'd be looking at the narrative. How does the narrative change? And that would be something that would be telling me about the audience. But actually, what I was able to see from really those changes is that actually the audiences that engage with those lives on the continent, they add in their own elements. They change certain elements. So you get different recensions and so on. And so I suppose the way of looking at it is that they're active texts. So that tells us something about the people who are reading it, who are consuming it, who are engaging with the Patrick cult. It doesn't just tell us about the text, it tells us about the cult itself. So even though they're making small little changes on the continent, it's telling us that there are audiences on the continent who are engaging with Patrick and who Patrick is and who they think that Patrick is. So that was something that was surprising to me, because obviously when we think of Patrick, we think, Irish. And granted, some of these audiences are Irish on the continent, but they're not all Irish, but then gives us a glimpse into the creation of a saint and the longevity of a saint. And how is it that a saint actually is, kind of their renown? How is it that actually is preserved? And it's preserved by people engaging. So it's not just the text and the fact that the text is there, it's about the people who are altering the text even slightly, who are taking out a story, who are putting in a story, who are giving the stories to other groups. So yes, while you might not be able to say very precise things about who they are, you can still get a glimpse into what they're doing and how they're going about that engagement.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really good, and something I'll use in the future as well. This idea of audience as well, because I'm looking at Symphonian as well. So that's extremely interesting to me. And well, going forward with our interview, so what is your advice for students starting to study medieval Irish history and the cult of saints?
I suppose it's to read widely, and to question, to look at the primary sources, to think about new questions and new ways that you can look at them. And like there's a great wealth of information, and secondary reading on the cult of the saints. Okay. Sometimes when we look at the Irish material, it fits within that. Sometimes it doesn't. And I suppose you don't want to lose sight of the uniquenesses of the material within an Irish context either. But I think that, there are new approaches to sainthood in Ireland, and there's a number of scholars who are involved in that. So I would just say, just be curious, ask questions, think of new ways of looking at the lives, or reading the lives, and that will stand to you.
Absolutely, yeah, I totally agree. And as we have like an international community here watching us, mostly Brazilians, I would think, we're used to dealing with mostly Portuguese, Spanish, and French historiography. So to these people, do you think that it would be interesting, for example, to study both continental saints in France or Spain in a comparative way with saints in Ireland, and how the cult in both places develop?
Yeah. I mean, it's been done. I think Lisa
Yeah.
Patel has done it with Genevieve and Brigit. There's definitely ways that you can do it. It's really about figuring out what are the barometers and why would you look at these two saints in that way. I mean, that's always the question with comparative history.
Yeah.
You know, with Patrick, sometimes it can be quite good to look at Patrick because you have the confines of an island. Okay, so you've got a ready-made. Well, he's not a national saint, as I mentioned. He's an island-wide saint, so that makes him quite interesting. But yes, I mean there are comparisons, of course, that can be made, but it takes a lot of work to figure out why you are comparing saints. What
Yeah.
are the criteria and the reasons for that? Perhaps it's because of geographical boundaries. So if you have a saint who's very similar, perhaps it's because of the type of saint that they are. If they're like Patrick and they're a converter saint, if they're like Brigit and they're a female saint who is the founder of a very successful national or island-wide and international cult. So yes, absolutely, there are ways of doing that. I think that when we look at sainthood in Ireland, we have more work to do in terms of placing the kind of pantheon of saints that we have in Ireland, in medieval Ireland, within the context of the cult of the saints across the continent and in the West. I think it's important that we do that, and I think there is more work that needs to be done there.
Absolutely, yeah. And well, Now I want to talk to you about your future research now that you're publishing your new book. And so what comes after this? So what can we expect from you in the next few years? So do you have anything in mind? Do you have anything already starting to develop something? So what's going on?
Yeah, well, I suppose a lot of the research that I'm working on now kind of stems from the research I've already done. Um, new questions were posed, new conundrums, I suppose. So one of the things that kind of came out of my research was that I realized, listen, there's not I found it very difficult when I was doing the book to really put into context Armagh and the scriptorium at Armagh. Even though there's some fantastic work done in the area, there's just not a great amount that has been done. So one of the projects I'm working on now, it stems from a conference that I ran last year, is I'm editing a volume on the Armagh scriptorium. So that's obviously, a number, it's interdisciplinary and there's a number of scholars involved. So that's something I'm working on, I suppose, immediately, and hopefully will be done by next year. More broadly, what I've been working on is looking at Patrick in his broader context. Okay, so moving outside of just the hagiography and trying to get to grips with the cult of Patrick more broadly, both in Ireland and also outside of Ireland. Okay, so because from an early point, the patrician cult moves outside of Ireland. So I'm trying to find ways now to understand how that actually happens. And I mean, that is a project that's going to be much bigger, hopefully, but it's going to be something that's also going to have to be interdisciplinary. So, from my approaches alone cannot explain that. But there is a great deal of work that has been done, let's say, on Patrick and his relics, Patrick and his biography from other points of view, Patrick across a whole plethora of other types of sources outside of hagiography. So that is something that I am working on. It's the longer term project, I suppose, I'm working on at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds really interesting, and I'm looking forward to that as well. And so yeah, I think that's if do we have any questions there, Leila, in YouTube? I don't think we have any questions there. However, if you have any further questions, if you see this interview online and you have more questions for Dr. Dawson, you can always drop her an email and look for her on Google. She's a professor at Carlow College. And yeah, thank you for coming in here and for having us. So thank you, and
Great.
we'll see each other soon
And
enough.
happy St. Patrick's Day as well, of course.
Happy St. Patrick's Day. Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Diego. Bye.
Bye.